and it can be downloaded from our website. The tool draws on both international and regional standards and on a very wide array of constitutional practices throughout the world. And I should acknowledge the beautiful artwork that we have been able to use for this publication. It is from a painting called Ancestors by Sarita King, Aboriginal woman artist from Australia.
With that, I will turn it over. Just to say again that they reflect two different perspectives. So Shankar, of course, is coming more from the civil society perspective as a lawyer and advocate, and Romy, though he has a background in that area as well, is really now speaking more from the government side. So I really appreciate in the remarks that both of them can kind of bring out what those distinctions might be and how the tool might be useful or limited, as Linda said, for each of your respective sectors. So I think we'll start with Shankar, if that's all right. And I will just mute myself. Shankar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you very much for providing this opportunity to international IDEA. This is a very relevant program to expose about the relevant tools relating to the constitutions and how the constitutions can be assessed. And once again, that it's good to see you. And you said, you just addressed me as a boss. Now you are my expert. That's the turnover now. Okay, the Constitution is not only the supreme law. It is the source of rights, powers, and resources of the nations. However, this is not always the case. In the context of indigenous peoples, in many cases, Constitution is the source of discrimination, exclusion, and institutionalizes the structural violence against indigenous peoples. It is also the political documents that reflects the collective will of the people. However, the challenge is indigenous peoples are not recognized as a peoples in many constitutions in the world. Even many constitutions in the world recognize the indigenous peoples, their rights, which are good to read, but not realized on the ground. That results multiple forms of injustices, including racism, assimilation, discrimination, exclusion, and dispossessions from land, territories, and natural resources, and many more. So that's why the Constitutions has like dark side and a bright side as well. So now I come to the sharing about the Constitution 2015 of Nepal and the constitution making process that Amanda briefly touched upon. We were very lucky to having Amanda at that time. That was a very crucial time for us because we needed so many informations and experts, and also the connecting with the different organizations in the constitution making process to know about the norms and values of the constitutions. And also the conventionally, we all know about that constitutions and constitution making process. It's captured by the elite in many countries. So, but that's not the case right now, that what we have experienced. It's a participatory process, and it's also the domain is now not only to the elite, for the elite, but it's a domain of the people and the ground. So that is very crucial. So the discrimination, dispossession, historical injustices that might be, the source is the constitution, which I mentioned about it. That was also the case in Nepal, where I'm from. So we had like 10 years of armed conflict led by the Maoist party, and 7,000 people lost their lives, and lots of human rights violations, and still the impact we've been facing now from the both sides. The human rights violations were occurred by the army and the Maoist fighters side as well. The majority victims were indigenous peoples for two reasons. The Maoists raised the indigenous peoples issues, such as like historical injustices and structural violence and racism based on the Hindu caste system. That and then so that the strategy of the Maoist enticed the indigenous peoples, and a large number of indigenous peoples, they joined in a Maoist force. And The second one, the Maoists fought in the indigenous areas. So there was a peace occurred in 2006, concluded with having a kind of national consensus promulgating new constitutions through the Constituent Assembly. So meaning to say that the constitution is also the tool for the conflict management as well in the context of Nepal. And also when we talk about the conflict, then that impacts to the indigenous peoples, obviously, because they are so vulnerable. And then also the constitution making process directly, it's a concerns of indigenous peoples and everywhere. So, but what happened is the first Constituent Assembly, there was overwhelming representation of indigenous peoples. But when we talk about the representation of indigenous peoples, the representation was not meaningful, meaning to say that they were not accountable to the indigenous peoples, but they were accountable to their respective political parties. So we had like very slim space to raise the indigenous peoples issues. I know that I still remember Amanda and we were just like struggling to know about that, what kinds of good practices around the world, and what could be the best to the approach in the constitution making process, how the indigenous peoples can intervene effectively. So I guess that was the very beginning to emerge this tool. So the Amanda conceived probably that's the tool. She did not mention about it, but I guess when the tool came up as a book form, then I realized, I recalled about that whole process. Again, come back to the constitution making process. The first Constituent Assembly was dissolved because the indigenous peoples were so organized and so effective, and there lots of issues were raised in the constitution making process. The dominant group, the Hindu High caste group, who dominated the country for the 250 years, they did not want it to give a power share to the indigenous peoples and other excluded groups like Dalit and other Madhesis. So meaning to say that the constitution making process, it's also a process bringing all excluded groups in our countries, in our experience. I guess that when I read about the tools, it has been reflected very well that how these excluded groups can be included in the constitution making process, which is very, very crucial. And the first CA was dissolved, and then there was a second CA. So the second CA was structurally formed, systematically exclude the indigenous peoples and other marginalized groups, and so that the constitution making process ironically taken away again by the elite groups. So I have to raise about it, and then when I gone through these tools, that is marvelously explained about that how this process can be taken away, and how the excluded group can still be very active, and then can be careful about this whole process, so they can be the part of the constitution making process. So the new constitution was promulgated in 2015. And then what happened is there was a kind of a big argument between the excluded groups, including indigenous peoples, and the dominant group, because the dominant group, the mainstreaming political parties were representing the dominant groups. So they were saying that the new constitution is the best constitution of the world. And then so indigenous peoples were, and indigenous peoples movements and indigenous peoples leaders are quite reluctant. So what's happening and how to assess about the constitution. So we use these tools timely manner, that the draft form, it was provided by Amanda, and that used to analyze about the constitutions and what happened, that we came to know that the new constitutions, there are 11 provisions out of like 300 articles. There are 11 provisions against the indigenous peoples, 23 provisions which discriminate, and then 49 provisions that exclude the indigenous peoples, and 5 provisions that establishes the supremacy of a caste area again. So that we came to know that this constitution is the racist constitution. So that on that ground, indigenous peoples started taking the movement, and the government says that the constitution is not written in the stone, or so it can be changed over a time. So they have to, step back from their position. So that's why these kinds of tools is very helpful. I guess this is very important. This tool, when I gone through it, it has like two parts. One is like procedural part. I have already talked about it. And another is a substantive part. It's the content that has been very well elaborated, and Amanda has mentioned about it. How it worked, I mean, now I would like to, this is the relevant, this is the side event of the MRIP, and this tool can be very helpful for MRIP directly and indirectly. Why? Because this tool provides a pragmatic tools for assessment of the constitution of respective countries. And then I agree with Amanda's. Now the conventional thought about thinking about the constitution and constitutional matters that has been shifted a lot. Now the ordinary people, they should have like the capacity, or they should be able to understand the constitution, to analyze the constitution. This is the right tool. So I guess that I've been participating in lots of UN's meetings and forums. So many interventions are very good, but not technically probably that helpful to the specific, to support to the specific mandate of the UN forums or mechanisms such as MRIP. So these tools, if it has been widely used by the indigenous peoples and ordinary, what we call in a legal term is a layman, they can understand and they can realize about the constitution, and they can come up with a very good intervention, so that can be helpful for the MRIP. I guess that I would encourage to use and to at least read these tools and use it, because these all the another good point about this tool, what I found is it uses the demystified languages, very simple, plain languages laymen can understand about it. What we say often when we talk about the Constitution, Constitution is a living document, so it can be changed. If we have to rectify about the Constitution, if there is gaps and lapses, we can identify, and that if we have to rectify, if we have to amend it, this will be very, very helpful. And I should stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Linaji. It's very relevant and then important questions that you raised it, that how we can make it more users friendly, or how the outreach of the tool that can be made. One thing that, as I said, that this is the tool is in the demystified languages. Many legal terms are still there, but that has been explained very well in a simple language so people can understand it. But it's still there is a challenge of language barrier because of the English, which is not the first language of many indigenous peoples. Very few have they can understand English. So if that can be translated into another languages, and another, what I found is this tool is not only it's a very useful for indigenous people, but those other the bodies and authorities or leaders who is working in indigenous sectors or working for indigenous peoples. It's also very important for them also, because that we have, I mean, there are good constitutions having like a positive, a progressive constitution, as Amanda termed about it, that having a good provision about the indigenous peoples that reflects about the aspirations of the indigenous peoples, and also but again that that is not the sufficient. So that has to be translated in the ground, then meaning to say that there should be the another level of laws that has to be the enacted to substantiate about the constitutional provisions. But this tool will give exactly the right information that how the constitution provisions will be translated into the law, and that can be implemented in the ground so the people can feel about what is written in the constitution. It's number one, right? So this is very useful for the lawmakers as well, the parliamentarians as well, right? And also the lawyers themselves also. It's not necessary that all lawyers are the constitutional lawyers, so they need a kinds of the knowledge, special knowledge about the constitutional law. That is not sufficient. If you are even the constitutional lawyer, you may not understand about the indigenous peoples, the law or indigenous peoples concerns. You may have to face the challenge about it. This tool will give you the correct and pragmatic information in your career as well, in your legal field as well. So this is also the very useful for lawyers as well. That's what I felt. I mean, I have a feeling. Even that Amanda says that after promulgation of the Constitution, we have filed a number of cases in the Supreme Court. We got like very good jurisprudence and precedents from the Supreme Court. We use these tools that how to, to get like the references to substantiate our logic or argument in the court, right? So that's why this is very helpful for practicing lawyers as well. Not only the lawmakers, not only the leaders, not only the indigenous peoples, because what we have to think about it, the Constitution is not only only for certain people, certain elite people, certain the groups, but it should be for all. So that why what happened is when we use the questionnaires as a test on the ground, I realized about it. We translate it into Nepali. So the people are talking about and interpreting about the provisions of the Constitution of Nepal, referring to the UN, referring to the Convention 169, referring to the provision of the Bolivian Constitution in relation to the land territories and natural resources, in relation to autonomy, right? So that's why what I feel about it, this tool would be helpful for nation building process as well in a broader sense, in a practical manner, right? So I should stop here. So maybe my suggestion would be it should be translated into the different indigenous languages, and so prepare in a the thematic basis as well, what Amanda says about it. Maybe some people can use only one theme like land territories and natural resources. Maybe other people can use about like autonomy and self-determination part, or other can use about the free, prior and informed consent. So that's why maybe more resources will be produced, and it will be very helpful for the indigenous peoples and other stakeholders as well.